Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
You should be able to hear me. Okay. Hold on 1 minute.
There we go. Yep. I gotta find a way to get my camera working.
Good. That annoying backlight is gone now. So, how are you? How are you doing?
Doing well.
Okay, so it looks like Mary is here.
I am. I'm trying to figure out how to turn on a camera, but I think we'll just go audio because I can't figure it out.
Yeah, it doesn't matter a whole lot. Susie, where are you logging in from again?
I'm in Texas.
Okay, very good. Yeah. So you asked a question I noticed, and I posted an answer to it. It was the question you asked on De Doctrina. I don't know if you noticed it or not, but it's there.
I haven't had a chance to look, but thank you for answering.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. So, I'm going to send a text message here. 1 second. Sorry.
We're all multitasking.
Yes.
I'm flying out to Florida tomorrow, so I'm actually writing one last bill before I go.
Okay, great. Excellent. Okay, so Mary was here last time. So normally, Susie, the way I do this is I try to regardless of my intentions, I do end up talking probably the most, but I try to let students kind of take the lead, and I don't usually have anything prepared to talk about, and so I kind of try to keep it as student-driven and as freewheeling as possible. So if you guys have any questions or things you want to talk about that we could discuss that you want to discuss, we didn't get a chance to talk about last week or this week or whatever, or anything else, now's the time.
I've started in on Hugh of St. Victor.
Okay.
And I've gotten through 1.5 books.
Good.
Those are the ones we're supposed to skim, correct? Like 1 through 3.
Yeah. So you really could read just 4 through 6 if you're pressed for time, and just read 1 through 3 later.
Yeah, 1 through 3 is kind of dense.
Yeah. And I was gonna. I don't see Heather here yet. She was a little worried about the reading load and stuff. The thing is, and I've told John this before too, and I see John here. Hey, John. So,
hi. Hello.
The course is a lot like a wine tasting. So, if you I'm just kind of giving you as many samples from the from the wine vault of the history of biblical interpretation and biblical issue controversy from the history of the church, and you may not get a chance to finish every single glass that I give you, but that's okay because you can always go back to the bottle later. So, and the thing I'm going to be looking for the most on the final is just getting the main ideas of the course, and that would be you kind of thinking about, like, given all we will have learned by the end of the course, where Catholic scholarship should be going in the future. So, it's deliberately kind of structured to lead up to that. We're studying Method A now, which will be the sort of ancient approaches. But we're also looking at very specific ways of how those approaches prefigure modern approaches. And we're going to look at limitations of both the approaches and then try to figure out a way that we can sort of go forward to kind of, combine the best of both worlds and maybe avoid some of the pitfalls of both of them. That would be the idea. So in terms of the reading and stuff, I do have some specific questions about the stuff on the midterm, mainly from the first 5-6 weeks of the course. But those are mainly factual, different questions. They're not going to be detailed questions about any reading. So it's and they're largely concept driven. So if you don't read Hugh, 1 through 3, it's not the end of the world.
It's interesting just to see how he lays out sort of all of knowledge, that scholastic.
Yeah.
Some of it's kind of, interesting.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting, and you understand why people are so kind of in love with studying medieval philosophy, because it's a very sort of a synthetic way of looking at the world. It attempts to sort of make sense of everything.
Right.
In a way that almost nobody would try to do today without sounding like a nut. If you have someone who thinks he understands everything about the world, and typically he's got a theory that doesn't actually explain all that much, but maybe is being stretched beyond what it can really do. So that's why people like the Middle Ages so much. And it's also why that there's a lot of Middle Age nostalgia that you'll find in Catholic sort of intellectual circles, because at the time in the Middle Ages, you really had an attempt to kind of explain everything, and everything really seemed to fit together from the building blocks of logic, mathematics to the sort of higher truths, the ultimate knowledge being that concerning God Himself, and how biblical interpretation kind of fits into that. So you see a lot of in Hugh the attempts to sort of synthesize very Platonistic worldview that requires a lot of the kind of metaphysical imagination that you'd have if you were really deeply into a Platonic mysticism.
Mm. Did you have any comment? Did you have any comments on our comments about Augustine and Jerome and their?
Oh yeah, you guys were dead on. Every one of you got the basic ideas, right? I mean, and I think the reason I sort of steer you to that discussion is that, you have basically a fourth. I don't know if that was 4th century, early 5th century that happened. I'd have to look. It would have been either late 4th century, early 5th century that discussion happened, but. It's very easy to imagine that same discussion, being replayed over and over again in different ways in our own age. And in some sense, all of the debates after Vatican II, about modernization of the church versus respect for tradition, can be distilled into that same basic discussion there. And in a certain sense, neither one is really right, because they both have certain strengths of their argument and certain weaknesses, right? And I'm so hard to say which one really is right. I mean, you have a certain sympathy for both of them, I guess.
All right, I'm back in. All right.
Okay.
Well, I would say that actually they're both right in the sense that, yeah, we want to get as close to the original language and intent as possible, but sometimes things are a little heavy for people to understand, especially if they're brought up in a in a tradition. I'm small t, maybe some big T, and you have to break them in sometimes a little easier.
Yeah.
One example I gave was the on the Cardinal with Galileo.
Oh yeah, Cardinal Bellarmine. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which was his feast day the other day.
Yeah.
And he wanted him to hold off until the theory or his hypothesis was proved out. And I could understand why he was saying that, because everybody thought, the sun revolved around us. Now to all of a sudden wake up the next day and find out you've been wrong.
Yeah.
That could be pretty shocking for a lot of people.
Right.
So I understand both sides of the argument, both Augustine and
Yeah,
Jerome.
exactly.
I think they're both right. I don't think they're wrong in a sense. There needs to be a balance.
Yeah.
It's also like even modern day, like where we now can take communion in hand
Mhm.
as opposed to just on the tongue. I think being introduced the way it was and not explained as far as being, Novus Ordo is, like something new when it really isn't.
Yeah.
Goes back to Jerome and so forth. People, I think started to lose the reverence for
Yeah.
the Eucharist
Yeah.
as opposed to what it was beforehand. And I think because, again, it wasn't explained as well as it should have been. So I think the arguments of both are really not either one is right or wrong. I think
Yeah.
there needs to be an understanding that both really should need to work somehow, together.
Right, and the Galileo is a really good example because, in some ways that exact problem, played out again in the 20th century with new findings with Bible scholarship. So you go through the cycle where there's a new discovery or what seems to be a new discovery. You're going to have a certain amount of skepticism about it, resistance to it, and of course the person who makes the discovery who feels very certain about it is going to tend to push an interpretation of his own discovery that's very maximalistic and portray the people who are resistant to the new truths as being unscientific, ignoramuses. And so the new truth comes along, and the guardians of the old truth are feel like they're discredited, and in fact, in the long term, the finding of Galileo had almost no effect on biblical interpretation. But there's a tendency then, but there is this sort of lasting, credibility problem that the church suffered because it was slow to embrace the change when in fact, maybe if the change had been introduced more slowly and more cautiously and there had sort of been a way of presenting it in a way that was a little less scandalous, that it would have gone much better all around.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's taken, when it first came out, and I remember when I was growing up in it, and it's like the Catholic Church has abandoned everything and kind of went the way of the Lutherans. And there's a movie called The Novitiate I recommend people to watch, and how it affected the whole convent of nuns.
Right.
And I don't think the bishops themselves were fully informed really of what was going on. Neither did they pass it on to their priests.
Right.
And it was almost helter-skelter there for a few decades. It's only recently that everything's coming back, where people saying, "Oh, okay, well, that was done in the early church. So this was, it's not new, as far as we just decided to make it up."
Right. Exactly. In a lot of ways, I think that the changes were probably not well explained.
Right.
And the people who were knowledgeable about these things, who were privy to the debate that took place during the council and leading up to the council, do this sort of thing, and they understood what was going on, but then there was this pastoral problem that you had a bunch of people in the pews, and many priests, in fact, who had been groomed to believe that nothing really could change. And then when it did, there was a lot of cognitive dissonance there that was caused a lot of destabilization. And then, of course, other changes then started happening that really maybe went beyond the council, or took some of the ideas of the council and followed their trajectory and pushed them much further than the council itself did. That was
Right.
another problem, and that's
Or-
still
Or
still
misreading, and misreadings of the council, don't you think?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, my stance is on Jerome and Augustine. They're both right. I
Yeah,
think there
right.
needs to be a balance on how things are done within, the church and with the laity, as well as, of course, the clergy.
Right.
You know.
It was kind of fun to read their, I went to New Advent and read some of the letters, and, without calling each other names, they were kind of calling each other names. I mean, Jerome basically saying, oh, I'm just a poor monk in my cell and you're a bishop, and yet you knew what he was really saying.
Right. Yeah.
Jerome had a reputation of being a very acerbic personality.
Yeah.
And actually, he didn't seem to like a whole lot of other people. He said some. He said a lot of kind of nasty things about a lot of people that he debated with. So, of course, polemics at the time were, more. It was somewhat more polemical age than the one we have now, where debate tends to be a little bit more respectful. Although I will say the polemics are slowly coming back again. If you look at internet debates and that sort of thing.
You gotta take a look at the Japanese their parliament,
right.
and see how they throw chairs at each other and everything else. Yes, really bad.
Why?
Exactly. So, but yeah, Jerome is kind of interesting that way. So,
and it's I even the parliaments in Congress, everybody's polite, like on camera. But when they get in the back rooms and what have you, I'm sure it's not always nice.
well, it depends, right? I have a feeling a lot of the arguments they have in public are sort of staged, and they probably they probably don't do that as much behind the scenes because it's normally in their interest to not be personally nasty to each other when they're trying to actually agree on something and pass something. But so that's right. There is a lot of times staging of debates and stuff. So yeah, but yeah, exactly. So
yeah, people are people. I mean, doesn't matter if they're in church or in government or anything else. I mean, everybody has their strong beliefs or stances that they want to take, and they fight for it. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Exactly. So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Not directly related to what we're doing, but the Sadducees, they didn't believe in the resurrection, only believed in the first 5 books and what have you. So, what was the point? What's the point of going through all that ritual, and in the end you just disappear? It just didn't make any sense doing all that. When you could eat, drink, and be merry and have fun and die anyway.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting what you say, because the thing about the Sadducees is that they didn't survive really, the Roman War of 67 to 70 AD to really tell their own story. And so what happened is that we got records of them and what they believed, but largely characterizations of their belief from people that didn't agree with them. So it would be sort of like if, going back to the political analogy, if you had Republican philosophy described by Democrats or Democratic philosophy described by Republicans, it might come out sounding different than the way that the advocate of their philosophy would hold themselves. So when we say that the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, what does that really mean? Does that mean that they absolutely rejected it, or does it mean that they didn't hold it as central as some of the people who were attacking them? That's a good point. I mean, that's a good question, right? So we don't really know.
No. We
Because
know Jesus challenged him on it.
right, exactly. So it may have been not so much a rejection of it, but it may have been uncertainty about how it would really work. Another theory is that they sort of did believe in it, but they kind of their public posture was to kind of downplay it, precisely because the belief in the resurrection tended to be a destabilizing belief, because it entailed the idea of a new sort of world in which the high will be made low, which the low will be made high, which the humble will be exalted, and the exalted, proud and exalted, will be humbled. So it's going to basically turn everything on its head, and people who are closest to the centers of power don't really have an incentive to, draw attention to that belief, and would have every incentive to kind of downplay it. Okay, and maybe one of the ways they downplay it would be to sort of draw, doubts or questions about it, like, well, how is this resurrection thing actually going to work? So, and this is the problem. Sometimes debating postures are different than what people really believe. Sometimes debating postures are, in fact, this is often the case, that people will take positions in a debate that are more tactical positions than they are what they truly believe in, because they're afraid that once they concede, point A, then it's going to lead inevitably to point C, D, E, and F, and they don't want C, D, E, and F, so they have to sort of downplay point A. And so what the Sadducees really believed is sort of a mystery. And this is another question too, that there's another line too, that they don't believe in angels. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that they actually reject, what we come to believe as angels, or is it that they reject the idea that a person after they're dead can come back alive in a disembodied form, right? Is that what they would have understood an angel to be? So, because, there actually are angels in the Pentateuch too. So, they presumably would have some explanation for those. So what would that have been? I don't know. There's any number of explanations there. So, but most characterizations of the Sadducees would place them as the most of the hoity-toity, aristocratic, closest to power, closest to Rome, closest to the Roman authority, members of the sort of temple governance system. That they would be the more aristocratic party, whereas the Pharisees would have been more the more hoi polloi. They would have been the more populist, a lot closer to the people in terms of a practical piety. They're going to be outside of Jerusalem as well, in places like Galilee, and they will advocate a strict purity, but in ways that are designed to appeal to purity as it can be lived by someone who's not a member of the professional religious. So they would have had a more popular following. That seems to be the case. And so for the Sadducees, we don't really know, because they're not around to defend themselves, and none of them really survived. And I'm not aware of any Sadducee writings that really survived either. But they seem to have been the party that was most disposed to Roman rule and dealing favorably on favorable terms with the Romans, and also in dealing in favorable terms with Herod. And that, once you sort of make that, strategic calculation, that, you best preserve the rule by dealing with the rulers of the powers that be, then that's, in some ways going to affect your theology as well. So, yeah.
Were the Sadducees, they were the priests, correct? In the temple?
I I don't know. I don't know. It seemed to be a pretty complex milieu there. So who were the priests? Hard to say. So you have there are two parties that we know of, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and there may have been different factions within those. And furthermore, to make it really complicated, is there may have been a lot of evolution of positions just between the time of the Maccabean revolt and the time of Jesus himself, right? In terms of sort of positioning themselves to just the evolution of a different religious party, in a context and time that's going through a lot of changes. It's sort of like the Democratic Party today versus Democratic Party 100 years ago. There's almost no similarities, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's be the same kind of thing. Republican Party is very different too. So
Yeah.
So you learn almost nothing by looking at the Republican Party, 100 years ago, Democratic Party 100 years ago, than looking at it today. But this is the problem is that we're trying to sort of reconstruct history in this kind of a way. And so who were the priests? Were they a separate faction? Were there priests that were members, like the high priests? Could they have been Sadducees or Pharisees? I don't know the answer to that. I think the the details of the ins and outs of those kinds of details of religious life in first century Judaism, we really don't know as much as we'd like to know.
Yeah. Now, this does show Zechariah doing priestly functions in the incense when Angel Gabriel visited.
Right, exactly.
And he was
Does it say whether it doesn't say whether he's a Pharisee though or a Sadducee?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't say who he belonged. It just says he's doing his priestly functions like they had. You do incense this week, and this week I do sacrifice. Right. And it seems like there was a bidding thing. Everybody had their route.
Exactly.
But it doesn't say whether he was a Pharisee or not, or Sadducee.
Right.
So
Exactly.
Interesting.
Could it be that there were also priests that were neither? That there were priests that were neither Pharisees nor Sadducees? I mean, you said we don't know. So
yeah. I don't know that you really have to be either a Pharisee or a Sadducee. Yeah. I just think that they're the two sects that we know about from the evidence in the New Testament, which is the big chunk of the evidence we have. So we know about them. We know about the Qumran sect. Starting this century when we discovered the Qumran caves. But I think the Essenes are mentioned once in the New Testament as well. So we know about them. The Zealots, they are mentioned as well in passing. But what are they other than that they're people that wanted presumably to overthrow the government violently in the vein of the Maccabees? But could you have had zealots that were also, zealot sympathizers in the Pharisees and the Sadducees, maybe, or Pharisees? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
So it's a very complicated milieu, and and the problem is that everything is going to keep changing. So you have sort of a government by a high priestly authority, which seems to come in around the time of, the Restoration. You do have a kind of a priestocracy or a theocracy. So there is a succession of high priests, and we do have a record of them. So we do have a sense of the actual chain of succession, but in terms of how that relates to the various factions that emerged after the Maccabean War, which is what the Sadducees and the Pharisees went out of. I don't know that anyone really knows that. Yeah,
it's interesting, and it seems the ones who are most interested in really understanding Jesus and eventually became or worked with Christians the most were the Pharisees.
Right. So, which you'd expect, of course, because the Pharisees, we think, seem to be closer to the people, right? Just from the evidence in the
Right.
New Testament, that they seem to be close to the temple, but they seem to be a little bit closer to the people. They do seem to be around and about where Jesus happens to be. They seem to, interact with John the Baptist more. They seem to, know what's going on in terms of the daily piety of ordinary, Jews living in Palestine in this time. So that they do seem to be the the sect that's a little bit closest to the ground and a little bit, less focused on the temple itself. Now, Paul tells us that he was a Pharisee, and of course, Paul was from Tarsus, which is in Turkey. So I think it's in Turkey, isn't it? So it's
Yeah.
So it's so presumably there was a Pharisee, or maybe he became a Pharisee later. I'm not sure if he was a Pharisee when he was in Tarsus or not. But at any rate, there do seem to be a Pharisee presence in the diaspora where Jews were scattered. They really did seem to be a little bit less temple centric in their piety and in their understanding of things, and they probably also had a notion of eschatology that was a little bit more robust than what you had in the Sadducees. In other words, the first century, although things in Jesus' day were rather quiet, right before Jesus, there definitely is in the air this idea that something's going to happen fairly soon. That there's Jesus finds an audience for this message that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. John the Baptist is preaching it. This is eschatology talk. So when you say the kingdom of heaven is at hand, the kingdom of God is at hand, what you're really saying is the time is nigh in which God is going to make good on his promises. And when that happens, not necessarily the end of the world, but the certainly overturning of the existing power structures of the world is going to be part of that.
Like, could the Pharisees and Sadducees be a type of religious order, like we look at Dominicans and Franciscans?
Yeah, maybe a little bit, but there's probably a lot of politics too, because there's going to be the very practical issue of what your attitude is toward the Romans, and what your attitude is toward someone like Herod, who clearly is, while he's very powerful in his own right, at the end of the day he's essentially a Roman satrap, representative, however you want to describe him. I mean, he's there because Rome wants him to be.
Right.
But he's also at the same time sort of pretending to be, this sort of quasi-Davidic figure by, rebuilding a glorious temple. He's doing all these kind of crazy, grandiose building projects all over Palestine, many of which have survived today. If you go to the Holy Land, you'll see a lot of Herodian architecture, the colonnades, the agoras, the auditoriums. The temple itself is gone, but the platform in which the temple stood is still there. And so, he's doing all this kind of stuff to really conjure up notions of David. And so there's very much, religious, but also very much a political response to how you're going to, deal with somebody like that. Are you going to work with him? Are you going to, pretend to work with him and secretly oppose him and wait for his destruction? So it's hard to say what the Pharisees, idea was. They probably wanted to work with him to a point, but probably at the same time didn't want to be so close to him that if and when he were to fall, which you would have to, of course, if the kingdom of God were really at hand, then they don't want to be part of the fall with him. That they want to be part of the victory team. So, so maybe the Pharisees were kind of hedging their bets a little bit. You got a question, Susie?
I'm just taking it all in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, none of this is going to be on the final. We're just sort of just chatting. So.
Okay. I'm enjoying it. I'm learning.
Good. Okay. So the thing about the Victorines is going back to that discussion we had at the beginning of Augustine and Jerome. The Victorines were, someone like Hugh very much, grew up in the theology of Augustine, but at the same time, he really is also in the mode of Jerome in terms of his love of biblical study, which is why we're studying him. And in particular, his love of Hebrew and the idea of Hebrew truth and the idea that the Hebrew Old Testament really should trump the other translations that were on offer at the time, particularly the Greek and also the Latin. So Hugh was one of the first Hebraists that we know of in the early Middle Ages. I'm not sure that how he learned Hebrew, probably in contact with rabbis. They were around in the Middle Ages in and around Paris where he would have been. And so if you see Hugh's theology, it's very Platonistic. I have some graphs of kind of images of what a very Platonistic notion of a Christian Platonistic notion of the Bible would be. And this really began sort of an age of the age of a sort of Hebrew truth, which Jerome had championed, but also this age of sort of Hebrew mysticism, that the idea that Hebrew was the language that God had created the world in, the idea that he spoke the world into being through the words of Hebrew. And so there's a certain magic telephone, if you will, if you learn Hebrew, that you can experience a sort of mystical connection with God that's not quite available through reading the Bible in a vernacular. So this is one area in which the medievals, contrary to what I think a lot of Catholics assume, in which the medievals were doing everything in Latin, they were, but there also is a school of biblical interpretation, which is even going back to the early Middle Ages, emphasizing the reading of the Bible in the original languages where available. And so this is in many ways a harbinger of the modern approach that we'll really see in the Renaissance, although we're still several centuries away from the Renaissance. So the idea of reading the Bible in Hebrew was not a new thing, but by any stretch of the imagination. And Jerome's idea was picked up by many medievalists, particularly in the school of St. Victor. Next week, when we get into next week we get into the school of St. Victor, we'll see the controversy that arises from reading the Bible in Hebrew, reading the Old Testament in Hebrew. That there are going to be certain controversies with this when it runs up against reading the text in a sort of a traditional way. And I think was it Mary? Were you the one that asked about Isaiah 7:14? I can't remember.
Is that the virgin shall conceive?
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Whether it was you, yeah,
Yeah.
right. So we're going to get into that controversy of whether the text should be translated virgin or whether it should be translated young woman. And so that's going to come up where later on we looked at Andrew St. Victor, which is a descendant, not a biological descendant of Hugh, but one of his fellow Victorines, where this issue comes up again, and once again it goes back to the same issue we've had before. What weight do we give to tradition, and what weight do we give to original texts? And once you answer that question, you're going to answer the question about whether we should prefer the translation young woman or whether we should translated virgin.
One question, you said it would have been like Victor, and that's like Paris, so that would be the West looking at reading in Hebrew. What about the Eastern side of things? Did they also, or did they just stick to Greek right from the?
It's hard to say. As far as we know, yeah. I'm not an expert in the Easterners, but I am pretty confident saying that there was not a lot of Hebraism in the Eastern Church. It was very much a Greek church, and so it's partly one of the reasons why has not been a tremendous amount of Eastern influence over biblical, modern biblical study. Whereas it's been almost entirely a phenomenon that's grown up around the West. I just don't know of a lot of evidence that any of the Eastern fathers were particularly interested in Hebrew. In fact, my sense is that the Septuagint is still pretty much their Bible, right? If you read an Eastern Bible, they probably have vernacular, but it's going to be based on not Jerome's Vulgate, which is in turn based on Hebrew, but just
right.
on the Septuagint version that was available. So.
Yeah, from when I have Orthodox friends. Yeah, it's the Septuagint. Their King James version.
Right, exactly. And so
it would be the same thing for Eastern Catholics as well?
Well, yeah, you're kind of straddling the fence there a little bit because you're Catholic, so you're sort of in the broader family, but your theological pedigree is very much, if you're an Eastern Catholic, and John will tell me if I'm wrong, but if you're an Eastern Catholic, your theological pedigree is going to be more Eastern. So
yeah,
you're gonna
and closer to Orthodox from
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I have a good friend who's married to a Eastern Rite deacon. So yeah.
Right. So we've had people. I've had a fervent Easterner who's taken this course before, and it was pretty interesting getting Raymond Vincent. So he's a really strong Eastern Catholic, but he doesn't like any sort of even implied negative generalizations about Eastern Catholics. About being frozen in time or about being not particularly helpful in terms of biblical scholarship and stuff. But the thing is, from a Western point of view, these things are true because, you are, the East is very traditional, right? But of course, the tradition is kind of set around the Church Fathers and the Eastern Fathers, and so the tradition is whatever they did. So, which is fine, but there is a things before that as well. So so you obviously can define tradition differently than that.
Well, and there's also a sense of maturity that. See, my Eastern brothers, I always kid around with. I said, you guys are all stuck in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Right.
And we have lively discussions in that respect because there's a certain maturity that's gone on in the Catholic Church. I mean, for instance, and they can't really argue with me on a lot of these points, like St. Chrysostom and so forth. We're vehemently anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
So you're not going to find a lot of Hebrew coming out of the Eastern side.
Right.
Now, through maturity and growth, we've gotten away from all that as far as the Western Church. and they're still lagging behind,
Right.
waiting for the Pope to come back to
Right.
the 8th and 9th centuries.
Right.
And
Well,
check us out.
Right. Exactly.
I'm being sarcastic, but
Right. Right. No,
uh,
but the anti-Semitic thing is actually a really important thing. We're gonna get into that as well. This I don't know if it's this week or next week we start, or the week after, but we're gonna start to see that the medievals take a somewhat different view of the letter and spirit model of Origen and Augustine than they did, because in a way the letter and spirit model could be taken in a way that's simply dismisses the Old Testament as being dead and deadly in and of itself, and not to be read without the Spirit. And if that's the case, then why would you want to solicit help from Jewish interpreters to make sense of difficult Old Testament texts? Well, we're going to see that in the Middle Ages, you start to get more and more dialogue between Christian interpreters and Jewish interpreters, not only through the Hebrew instruction, but also through interpretation. The idea being that the literal sense of the ancient text is the literal sense, and if Jews are closer to the literal sense because they understand the sort of religious logic of it in a way that Christians don't understand, it probably would be helpful to listen to what they're saying. And so we'll see that Aquinas frequently cites Rabbi Moses Maimonides and Rashi, Rabbi Ben Solomon ben Isaac, to shed light on difficult Old Testament texts. But this is not something that would have been done in the church by the church fathers, because why, if you have the Spirit, why do you want to learn the letter? You know what I mean? Why do you want to learn from the people of the letter if when you have a chance to learn from the people of the Spirit? So there's an inherent problem in in the letter Spirit formulation that was in need of some refinement. And this is something that really began, Jerome sort of planted the seed with it, but it began to grow a lot more in the Middle Ages, and this idea that actually we probably have something to learn from our Jewish brothers about the Old Testament. We need to be careful because they might be hostile to our Christian readings of the Old Testament, but by the same token, the idea that there could be wisdom and insight gained from them when it comes to difficult, Hebrew words maybe, or Old Testament passages, or understanding the logic of particular books, there might be something to be gained there.
Oh, I think so, definitely.
Yeah.
That's why I have studied, or certain even Jewish organizations which they consider messianic, as far as it's just another Protestant denomination, but at least they're looking at it from a Christian viewpoint,
right,
and not being hostile to it,
right,
but explaining the Jewish side or Jewish understanding of things.
Right.
And also there's there's a book out called Surprised by Christ. It was written by a priest named Bernstein. Believe it or not, he's an Orthodox priest with a Bernstein, Jewish name, because he was a Jewish rabbi.
Right.
And he brings a lot of insight of the Jewish understanding of the Old Testament, or the Septuagint, to Christianity. For instance, this one controversy over young woman or virgin. One of the things that was said is that in Hebrew, young woman can best be understood as a maiden, while virgin, you could be a virgin and married, but you can't be a maiden and be married.
Right.
Okay, in the Hebrew thought.
Yeah.
So you're really not hurting the verse, is not being hurt by using either one if you have understanding of Jewish thought.
Right.
Mhm.
It's not the way we think of, well, you know, such and such as a young woman, she's 25, let's say, and yet she has children. It's not looked at that way in the Hebrew culture. A young woman is a maiden who's totally not, not married to anybody. Who's never been married.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So would be a virgin. So they said it doesn't hurt the text either way.
Mm-hmm.
One's more of a Western thought, and the other one is an Eastern thought.
Right.
That's just one example.
Yeah.
Another one I thought was interesting was the wedding at Canaan, where here you have both literal and, of course, we understand the spiritual significance behind it with Mary asking Jesus, telling Jesus about the wine. In Middle East and Near Eastern weddings, when you were invited to a wedding, you sat according to your stature,
Right.
your age, and who you were in the community. And then each male firstborn would go down the table at certain points where that each one would offer a toast, like we would do a toast. It would be a blessing. And when Mary approached Jesus and said, there's no, they're running out of wine, it's almost in an Eastern thought saying, well, and when Jesus replied, well, woman, it's not yet my time. It wasn't his time to make the blessing. It was almost a way of making it light-hearted of what was actually being done.
Right.
But yet he knew what she was saying. But it also shows a personality or a side of Jesus that a lot of people think he's just a stoic, robotic person. In fact, in Mark, there's quite a few things that he does which are, if we understood the Eastern culture, we would consider quite funny.
Right.
And in fact, there's some things that he says they're devils or this, that. The actual words, if we were to use it in our vernacular, would be quite harsh.
Yeah.
A lot stronger than just calling somebody a devil.
Right.
So they bring that culture that we really don't understand in the West, and bring it out, on what it was more similar to, his time period, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And fun.
It sort of reminds me of the story you just told. He's deceased now, but there was a priest I know. I used to be from Columbus, Ohio, and when the bishop doesn't like a priest, they'll give him a bad parish and a bad area, and give him no resources to make it work, or just the very minimum, that kind of thing. And so he was in kind of a rough neighborhood. And he's African American also, so it was good. And he would pack heat under his cassock and protect himself.
Right.
And he was he had his own kind of way of dealing with things, and people would come up and ask him for money and stuff like that. He said, "You're not getting anything right now, so you could come back tomorrow." I mean, he was just very no nonsense about it, but yeah, he just had a certain way about him. And one day he was explaining to me that. He said, "You know what Jesus called the Pharisees?" And I said, "No." He said, "Dirty sons of bitches."
Yeah. Basically, yeah.
I said, "Huh?"
They don't put that language in the Bible, but
yeah. And he says, "Look, what's the lowest thing you could say in that particular society? It's a viper, right? If you call someone a viper, that's the lowest thing you can call yourself society. So, and we're talking about sons of vipers, the brood of vipers. Basically, just like a dirty son of a bitch. So that's exactly the same thing, right?
Yeah. So and the Bible's light. Doesn't the Western interpretations of a lot of things, because we don't understand the culture, we miss the point of a lot of things.
Right.
And I try to tell people, this is an Eastern book. It's you can't project your Western thoughts on a lot of things.
Right.
And there's some things that Jesus says you wouldn't believe he said. Jesus wouldn't talk like that. Well. it got the point across. I mean,
Right,
that's
right.
the whole thing. And there's a lot of cultural things that he did. We just either gloss over, we read it, but we don't really see the depths of what it means.
Right.
And it's so understanding part of biblical interpretation, I think, also needs an understanding of Orientalisms and culture of the time, and not just
Right.
direct
Right.
translation.
Right. Right. And I think Augustine talks about that a little bit in De Doctrina, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like us if we write something. Well, I had a hot dog. I ate a hot dog the other day.
Right. Right.
Now, somebody from another culture 1,000 years from now may say, let's say, the whole world went vegetarian or something like that.
Yeah.
This person actually ate a dog.
Right.
It was hot.
Right.
You know,
right. It was hot.
if
Yeah.
you take it literally.
That's a good example. I like that example. I'm going to use that. Yeah. I like that. Yeah.
You have to understand the culture and the
Right.
isms of the people. You know?
Right. Right.
And
That's
basically,
right.
it's Orientalisms from that time. So.
Well, that brings up when you think about knowing the culture in a certain way, how can we? When I was in undergrad, I did several classes in archaeology. It was just an interest of mine. And you look at, okay, what are you looking at? You're looking at this or that object or this or that from a particular culture, and then trying to extrapolate what was the culture like. And I would wonder sometimes if we were getting it wrong. I mean,
Right.
you can't always tell by what something is. And so I was with my family and we were watching The Little Mermaid like a week ago. And there's a place in there where the Little Mermaid has all these things that have come from the human world, and somebody tells her that a fork is basically for combing her hair, and then she goes up to have dinner with the prince, and she starts combing her hair with the fork and realizes that's not what it's for. And
Right.
Right.
it's like being out of the culture and trying to figure out what these things really are,
Right.
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 Yeah.
and what meanings are. So
Yeah,
Anyway.
no, that's absolutely true.
Very true.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard enough to get all the nuances of your own culture, right?
Yeah.
Let alone one 2,000 years ago. Just think of like new words, my old example used to be the word bad, right? That the word bad used to mean bad, and then it kind of came to mean good. I mean, now that's an ancient example. I mean, that's probably 40-year-old example, but now the word filthy. You ever watch baseball? The word filthy. Have you ever heard the word filthy?
Yeah.
Or sick. Filthy and sick, in the context mean like a really good, effective pitch or something like that nobody can hit.
Mm-hmm.
The words kind of carry on really, really odd meanings given the culture.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the word gay.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Right.
Yeah, the word. Yeah.
Well, and then you use the words, but then you're talking about something using those words, and those words might mean something different, and what you're talking about might mean something different as well. I mean, the whatever, event or something like that.
Right.
So what's a good source to get to understand the culture better and to understand these nuances? I mean, what's a good place to start?
Most commentaries, most critical commentaries nowadays will try to the extent they can to bring this out. So if you pick up a commentary on most of the Gospels, you nowadays will try to bring out, or recreate a scene that maybe the way that it would have looked, or try to capture particular nuances that a particular teaching might have had, or a parable might have had. But it's very speculative because we don't have a whole lot of other sources to work with, right? So I don't think that's a great answer to your question, but I would say if you want like an encyclopedia one, try to, if you want to bring out there's a lot of sort of socioeconomic or sociological oriented commentaries in the New Testament you could start out with. And, they would attempt to bring out sort of nuances in the culture that particular phrase or word or parable or something like that might have had. And then you can sort of see, if you look at their footnotes, where they're getting it from. They're attempting to do all they really can do, which is try to reconstruct a culture out of the available literature, written elements that have survived. So that's a lot of what we have. And then there's also archaeological evidence we have too, which is, there's almost no archaeological evidence of early Christianity because, what would have survived? I mean, there's nothing in the first century to survive, right? That they just met in houses and stuff. And, you have some tombs and things like that, but that's about it. But we do have some sense of what the ancient culture was like. A good commentary on Pauline letters will try to bring out like what first century Corinth would have been like, given where it is in the map and that kind of thing. So that's probably where I would start. I come up with specific examples for you if you're interested in a particular book, but
they're on like a popular book kind of thing. I don't know. Are you familiar with Brant Petra's book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist?
Yes.
Because I've had people tell me that, and I haven't read all of it. I had people tell me that that's very good on explaining culture. Now, whether it's actually accurate, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's very good. I have the CDs also. I used to listen to my car until I bought my new car and realized I didn't have a CD player anymore because I'm still stuck in the 90s, I guess.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it's very good. Explaining a lot of the background or the Orientalisms, I call them, of the time.
Yeah.
Trying to bring it to the modern view.
Right.
It does.
Right.
I think he does a good job.
Right.
I used to be very into all that years ago. I had a few books on those things that I found them interesting.
So for Old Testament world, there's kind of the old work that people used to read was Alfred Edersheim, which
yes, that was
which is kind of dated, but
yeah.
Is nevertheless it's publicly available and it's a fun read because he brings out a lot of as a Jewish convert to Christianity, he brings out a lot of different things that he thinks, are nuances that maybe could apply in terms of, what the religious milieu of first century Judaism would have been like. But of course, we learned a lot from the Qumran as well. Mm-hmm. So we've learned an awful lot from that particular. We learn a lot about that particular sect. Now, how representative that sect is for everyone else is, probably not very, but it definitely shows you a certain trajectory that Jewish thought can take. And a lot of things that people read now, like scholars read now to try to understand like a religious background is the intertestamental works, which are not in the Bible, but there are a lot of the works like Fourth Ezra, Second Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Targums, a lot of the writings of Jews that have survived in sort of between the time of the Old Testament and New Testament, to sort of shed light on what at least some Jews were thinking or were expecting. Those come in a lot also in modern commentaries if you read them. So those are some of the advantages of modern commentaries.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of. One of the things I thought was interesting as far as an Orientalism was where Jesus said, "You strain at a gnat and swallow a camel."
Yeah.
One of the things I had read was, and they still do it today. They strain the tea, and then strain when they're gnats. There's a lot of gnats in the area that fall into the tea,
Right.
and they strain it out. But during time of Christ, the little strainer they would use was actually made out of camel hair.
Oh.
So when they're straining, and if you ever used a real hair, like boar brush for shaving or whatever,
Right.
and the hair, piece of the bristle comes out, it's the same idea was what he's saying. They're straining, trying to get these little gnats out, and the hair of a camel falls in there, and they swallow it. So it's like, that's what he's saying. They strain at gnats, but they end up swallowing the camels.
Yeah. So that of course gets a little controversial though, because if it changes the meaning of the parable. So the basic idea is between straining a gnat and swallowing a camel is that they're sort of focusing on the minor things and avoiding the larger things, right? That would be
right.
That would be the sense of it. So you have sort of a similar one with the parable. Well, actually, the saying of the rich man. It's easier for a rich man to pass through the. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom. And of course, you have any number of interpretations of that. Some people, it's even been suggested that there's a particular entrance into the gate of Old Jerusalem that was called the Eye of the Needle.
Yes, I heard
that it was kind of hard for a camel to get through, but it was possible with a lot of sort of effort and planning and that kind of thing. Or it's just a Hebrew exaggeration, right? And then you're saying it's freaking impossible for a rich guy to get into the kingdom of heaven. It's actually easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle, and that's another theory. A third theory is that there's it's a mistranslation between gamelos, which is the word for camel, and the word gamelos, which is the word for ship's rope. And so you're talking about putting a ship's rope through an eye of a needle, which sort of makes a little more sense than putting a camel through an eye of a needle.
Right.
But, but in any case, but then the question would be, we're doing the Orientalism here. Is it a form of exaggeration? Is he saying it's impossible? Is he saying it's hard? Is he saying it's unlikely? So obviously that matters a little bit in interpretation, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that gate, the Eye of the Needle, was the only place that you could, when Jerusalem would shut down as towns did at night, that was the only entrance to get into the city, was this small little gate called the Eye of the Needle.
That has been the claim, but that's also been challenged by people who are saying that interpretation arose apocryphally by people that just wanted to come up with a dodge of the obvious meaning that it was impossible for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
So it'd be better to say it's very difficult. But maybe by saying it's impossible, he's just exaggerating on the side of prudence, like it's really hard. But hard to say, right? I mean,
right.
Yeah. I don't think the people that have argued that there's a gate in Jerusalem called the Eye of the Needle have ever proved that there really is, such a place.
Yeah, I heard that was kind of disproven.
Yeah.
However, the rope that you were talking about is what the popular one is. It's probably translation of the word.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one too, because all the best variants we have the word camel, but my professor, not the one who taught me originally Greek, but the one who taught doctoral Greek, he stuck with his idea that really the reading that made the most sense is exchanging the epsilon for an iota, and the iota for an epsilon, and that's how we got that. But the problem with it is that reading's never been proved in any of the ancient manuscripts. There are some later ones that have that, but I don't think you'd get a serious argument from a text critic, although that's what he is. Everyone's entitled to their own idiosyncratic views, and that was kind of his. But
it makes sense also because Christ was involved with fishermen and boats and so forth, so it would be
right. Yeah, and the camel thing is just sort of weird, and that was kind of his point. Like why would you say that? That's such a bizarre thing to say. Yeah. And then he talks about swallowing a camel and was a gnat, and that's he says, well, yeah, that's a different metaphor, right? And so this one sort of makes sense. In other words, the reading that he taught us to prefer when we were looking at different textual variants is the reading that best explains the variance. And so even if there's no actual evidence for it, that's probably the original reading, even if you have to totally construct it. That's the Oxford School of Text Criticism, which is not what most American text critics do, but that was sort of one conclusion that he came up with that is not widely shared. But I do share it sometimes when I'm lecturing to undergrads on this, just as an example of a reading that could have been different, with just one letter being different. So. Right. Yeah,
and I have never heard that explanation of the ship's rope, but it does make it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It does. Yeah, and of course, and the word camel. His theory was the word camel came about because just a transposition between an iota and an epsilon, which could have happened in what's called an itacism when you. In Greek, there's a lot of vowel sounds that sound very similar, and so you could easily transpose one from another if you were in the case of copying a text that was being read as you were copying as a scribe. So that was sort of his take on that, as at least a possibility. We've never really found an ancient manuscript that has that reading, though. So maybe we will someday, and then he will be vindicated.
Yeah. Well, I know the disciples then answered back when he said that. Well, then who can be saved?
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And he says, well, with God, there's nothing impossible.
Right. Exactly. So you would expect something to be impossible, regardless. So that also sort of counts against the eye of the needle gate theory, which wouldn't be impossible but kind of difficult.
Right.
That sort of undermines the explanation afterwards and the response of disciples afterwards. So that I think counts against that a little bit. Right. So something you would want something to be impossible. So either a camel going through the eye of a needle or a ship's mooring going through the eye of a needle. Both those would be impossible, right? So,
right. Yeah. So the impossibility is just there, no matter whether it's the rope or the camel.
We would think so. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The disciples' response always got me. Then who then can be saved? He didn't say no. He's talking about rich people. So I would think the disciples would say, well, then how can any rich person be saved? He sounded like.
But who can be saved?
Yeah, they seem to take it literal for everybody.
Right, right.
So I don't see. Maybe they even misinterpreted what he was trying to say. I don't.
It's possible. It's possible. That's right. That's right.
So, well, they misinterpreted it on a regular basis. What he said, right? So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true.
Well. So any questions before I turn to you, Luz? I don't want to wear you out too much. We're pushing well into the 9th hour here. So
yeah, I gotta go. I gotta be up at 5 to leave for the airport. So I still need to finish packing. So
okay. Any questions, Susie, before we go?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for coming out, John.
Yeah, I just got an academic question as far as the college goes. Do you see them doing a doctorate in theology at CDU? Or?
CDU? Oh, yeah.
Well, they talked about it a while back.
Well, we really need a much more robust library, and we'd have to have a different model where we're meeting a lot more like this and not just doing asynchronous discussions. So that would, it's not impossible, but it would really be, to get something that's HLC accredited, it would be kind of a heavy lift. It could be done, but and ATS would be another thing too, because if you look at the kind of library resources that it takes to run a doctorate, and the other issue would be the funding, because if you're not able to support your grad students going through a doctoral program, at least some of them, there's a real question about whether the program would be viable. Now, one thing we could do is sort of piggyback on another university that had more resources and sort of work with them in some way, shape, or form. So I suppose that could happen. But,
yeah, I would think that would be that difficult to do that.
Yeah.
Especially now with the electronic age. I mean, I don't see
Right. Exactly. So,
heck, you can hook up to the Library of Congress if you want. You want a library big enough.
Right.
I don't.
But the thing about getting a doctorate is you have to really decide why you want a doctorate. If you want a doctorate to teach, if that's the goal, then you really need to, ramp up your capacity of both your faculty, your library, your endowment, a whole bunch of other things to really make it viable. It's tougher than you think in the American system. Now, you could do a sort of a low-grade doctorate where you basically just have somebody write a dissertation with some dissertation guidance, but
that's what they do in Europe. Right?
Yeah, the problem is with those kind of doctorates is you're not going to get a job. No American institution would hire you to teach if that was your background.
Right.
So that, and for a lot of people that would sort of, if you just want to go around and be a writer and just say you have a doctorate, just for your own professional credibility, that would be one thing. But if you're trying to gain credibility to get a decent teaching job, to be gainfully employed afterwards, you really have to ramp up your resources a little bit.
I'm thinking of it only in the future because I just like to continue to study.
Right.
I already have a PhD. It's not that I need one.
Right. Exactly.
I was just.
What's your doctorate in, John?
Educational psychology.
Okay. Yeah.
With concentration and testing and.
Okay.
Standardization.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that's great.
So I was just wondering if there was something you could go beyond,
yeah. So one thing we might do short of having a doctorate is kind of having some postgraduate seminars, maybe for students that are sort of highly motivated to learn more. I think we could do, where we just do like a postmaster seminar, maybe on a particular Bible book, or maybe a detailed study of like the text of Aquinas or the text of Augustine or text of Origen or something like that. So I could see where you sort of have a minimum cutoff of people you let in. They have to be graduates of the program, and they have to have had a certain amount of study in this before they get into it. They can't be novices at it.
Right.
So just to keep the discussion sort of interesting. Yeah.
Is there any
I can see that.
Is there any colleges that Catholic colleges that do doctorates?
Oh yeah.
Online without having to physically.
Oh, online doctorates. That's a good question.
Otherwise,
I don't know.
Okay, I was just wondering. You're forcing me to go to Trinity now in Lynchburg.
Okay, yeah, right.
So you're forcing me to be a Baptist now.
Right. It depends on what you want. Do you want it theology or scripture or catechetics, or what would you want it in?
I'm biblical.
Okay.
Scriptural.
Yeah.
Or even sacramental. I mean, I'm interested in both areas. Okay.
I don't know of any online ones off the top of my head, but there's a lot of stuff I've never heard of, so I don't.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah. So
that's it.
Okay. All right.
Okay, I'll just keep taking courses here, I guess.
Okay.
You got enough of them.
Okay.
Indeed.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Good
Take
night.
care. Thanks so much, Dr. Brown. Thanks for.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Night, John. Night,
Good night.
Susie.
Good night, Mary. Good